I'm Victoria Nece. Thank you so much for coming. I'm the product lead for After Effects, and like a lot of people on the After Effects team, actually, I was a motion designer before I joined Adobe. And so I'm here to talk a bit about the power of motion before I introduce the incredible work of our presenters. But first, I want to talk a little bit about birdwatching. And I love going birdwatching as a way to get away from screens. So I took this photo a couple weeks ago in the San Juan Islands in Washington. And there's like 20 birds in this picture. Here's proof. I have proof. I swear they're there. This is from the Merlin app. It listens for their calls. There's a bunch of sparrows in the field, and there's a whole flock of goldfinches in the tree. But you can't see them because the field is full of dense brush, and they're not moving. I can't even spot them if I zoom in on this picture. But a few seconds after I took it, they all flew off, and instantly they became visible. So this is an elaborate metaphor, because design is also a crowded field. And it's hard to stand out with so much content being created every day. That was a lot of the discussion in the keynote. But things that move stand out. Your eyes go to the bubbles or to the birds in flight. And that gives you the power to capture attention, to stop someone scrolling. Motion kind of just says to your brain, hey, look over here. And it's capable of a lot more than just grabbing that initial attention. So I've used the exact same effect on all this animated text. I just changed a couple of settings each time. And this is a simple example, but changing the way that things move can evoke bubbles or water or fire. Which feels the most urgent? Where do your eyes go first? Does one of these maybe feel a little relaxing? There's character in motion and things to learn. It's a key part of how you communicate a message. In my motion design days, most of my work was in documentaries. And you do a lot of asking yourself, what does a viewer need to know right now at this precise moment in time? What facts can we highlight? How can we make this information clearer, easier to understand, more memorable? And motion is itself information. Imagine dropping a bowling ball and a bouncy ball. They're the exact same size and color. But you already know which one's which, because how they move, how they respond to the world, tells you how heavy they are. And what you show first or second and how you transition from A to B can impact how you feel about it. Take this chart, for example. Documentary world is full of charts and graphs. Most of these numbers aren't that interesting, but that one, that's bad. Whatever that was, that's bad. You know how to feel about it because the camera motion conveys it. The change in scale conveys it. You kind of feel a little drop in your stomach. And motion it's design over time, from point A to point B, and how you get between them. And learning to design in motion can help you get from A to B in your career. It can help you stand out in a crowded landscape. And if you're making the dive into motion, we on the After Effects team, we really want to be with you every step of the way. For me, one of the coolest things about being a product manager on After Effects is that I get to think about how we design tools for motion design. And we spend a lot of time talking about how we can make this toolbox approachable for designers who want to get into motion. If that's you, there's never been a better time. We recently introduced the Properties panel, which should look pretty familiar. It's just like Photoshop's or Illustrator's, and it shows you what you can do with your assets. It's kind of a one-stop shop for all the most important stuff. And we've added more than 100 new presets that make building things like that animated chart or text effects just quick and easy to make your own. Plus, there's now hours of fantastic free training at adobevideotraining.com. Super easy website to remember. It's all free and includes the assets to download so you can follow along. I think one of the creators is actually here in the room, so there's some great sessions at Max from some of the same people that made this training. So it's a great way to continue your journey once you get started here. And if you're still unsure about getting started with motion, Spoiler alert, you already have. You already know a lot of what you need to succeed with motion. Motion is a design element, just like color or form, and you know how to use those. It's also not all or nothing. You can collaborate and learn from your colleagues. Graphic designers and motion designers team up to make beautiful things, as you're about to see. That's why I'm so excited for Michelle and Paola to show you the kind of projects they build together and some great ways to harness motion for your own purposes. So with that, it's an honor to introduce Michelle Higa Fox. I've actually known her longer than I've worked on After Effects, and it's been so cool to see her career grow from founding her own studio to leading the dynamite design team for Patriot Act on Netflix to group creative director at Buck, which is one of the best motion design teams in the world. So please welcome Michelle Higa Fox.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for that wonderful welcome. Thank you, Adobe Max, and thank you to the audiences here and online. My name is Michelle Higa Fox, and I've actually been using After Effects for 21 years. I can't believe it. Okay, for the veterans in the audience, that's when there was a radio tower and a blue outline border, so just shout out to that. I still have love for that era of After Effects. But as Victoria said, when I first came to After Effects, it actually wasn't through animation. It was through illustration, and it was also a collaboration. So I first started using After Effects working with the incredibly talented artist Leah Bieferman. And Leah would create these incredibly ornate, detailed illustrations of these fantastical cities that you see on the left. What I would do is I would take her cities, and I would do these very simple animations using only position keyframes. It's not the cell animation or the complex animation you might see in movies. It was actually as if I took her drawings and cut them out with scissors and just puppeted the pieces back and forth. But even doing this, the little wiggle that the basket makes before it gets pulled over to the right, almost like a magnetic pull, tells you a lot about the world that she had already started to make as she was drawing. So after starting to collaborate on these animations, we made an art piece called Kinetoscope, and the way this worked was there would be a crank, and you could turn the crank, and the direction of the crank and the speed of the crank would allow you to power the animations that were projected overhead and the animations that you could see by putting your head under the curtain and peeking inside. And we took this collaboration and we continued it into more sculptures. And what I love about these sculptures, again, is it's just heightening the stories that she was already telling. It's nothing too complex, but also the drawings and the animation aren't in competition. They're very much complementing each other, and they're kind of adding to each other's stories. So from these initial art experiments, I was kind of like, okay, I love After Effects. How can I do this for a living? And I was able, because motion graphics was starting to become a legitimate career at that time, to pivot into being a professional motion graphics artist. So this is the very first thing I ever made as a professional motion graphics artist. And what you can see is it is also based on a very ornate illustration. But when it comes to life, it looks like this. And once it's in motion, that allows it to mix with live action footage, even though the art style is very different. And underneath, the way it's animating is kind of a reveal effect of the art. It's what we like to call a write-on effect. And that write-on effect, when it's layered, becomes this really gorgeous tapestry. But underlying that is a very simple, approachable technique. But maybe some of you in the audience aren't in illustration. Maybe you're graphic designers, maybe you're UI, UX artists. So let's do a little zag. In 2009, Google kind of made its first entry into storytelling. And I was lucky enough to be on one of the teams that was trying to answer the question, can you tell a story just using interface? Can you tell a story just using search? And what we found was, even though the visuals were quite sparse, because the material we were working with and the canvas was so familiar, it really still drew the audience in. And you could tell a story just with these elements. So going from, yes, we can tell a story with just user interface, let's fast forward 10 years. The comedian Hassan Minhaj, he had a theory. He was like watching late night shows, and he noticed every show was someone at a desk and they had a PowerPoint presentation over their shoulder. And that presentation would just kind of go, stock image, newspaper headline, data visualization, and it was very static. And so he wanted to know what would happen if we took data visualization and it became more of a dialogue. And so I was really, really excited to work with a massive team on Patriot Act for Netflix to see what would happen if we could elevate design and animation to a co-host. It was no longer a backdrop. It was not filigree. It was not extra or an accent. It was actually an equal storytelling partner. It was like a Watson to the Sherlock Holmes, where they could work in tandem to tell the story. And this was super duper exciting. It was like, it really felt like a new way of storytelling that was immersive, and just finding new ways and new homes for animation. So after Patriot Act, I was really excited to explore what was already an immersive canvas and start exploring virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. This was a piece made by a big team at Buck with Meta and Studio Kaikaiki. For the Broad Museum in Los Angeles, Takashi Murakami had his first solo exhibit, but it was also the first time integrating augmented reality as part of the art. So these were massive, massive virtual sculptures. They were floating over your head, but they were also part of the story. It started outside. You could only see them if you were at that location, and then it would draw everyone inside and through the exhibition as part of the wayfinding and as part of the artwork. And this piece, and Patriot Act, to be honest, these are pieces that I could not have imagined working on 20 years ago. So a lot has changed in 20 years. And over that time, what I have seen over and over and over again is that change is constant. But screens are in more places than ever before. The need for storytelling continues to appear and has more and more canvases. What we used to think of as screens have become ubiquitous. They've become fluid. But the need for effective communication, the need for beauty, the need for delight is as great as it's ever been. And in these times of uncertainty, what matters most is resilience and adaptability. And graphic designers and artists and illustrators and the people in this room and at this conference have the skills that the future needs. The ability to tell a story, the ability to know what's going to resonate, the ability to know what kind of image will capture people's attention. And motion can extend those skills even further. It's just another tool in your toolkit. And I'm sure, looking at some of these examples, all of you probably have some ideas for motion already. How can it not come naturally as you're creating, imagining how else it could move? And that's because motion decisions are design decisions. How something moves impacts how it feels aesthetically and vice versa. So I wanted to show 3 more examples that will hopefully inspire you to see how motion intersects with design. And I wanted to start with branding. So when EA's famous video game series rebranded as FC24, Buck was able to partner with Uncommon on the new branding system to come up with the motion guidelines, all inspired by the beautiful game of football. We started with the graphic design system, very much based on the triangle, and all of the motion systems arose from there. The shape language helped us create consistency and cohesion across all surfaces and formats. And there were 4 core behaviors, which may seem simple, but that's kind of the point. They're supposed to be universal behaviors that can work across a giant system. So for example, we have trajectory. Everything that moves should be clear and focused. It should be bold. It should be poetic. It should feel like those players running down the field. Formation. Everything should move on an underlying grid. Maybe you see the grid, maybe you don't, but you always feel it's there. Momentum. Even as we're starting and stopping, we always feel like we're moving forward, just like the game. And lastly, match cuts. If everything is moving in sync, we can move from player to player, shape to shape, and it always feels unified. And when that comes together, it applies not just to shapes in motion. It can apply to typography, it can apply to footage, it can apply to every element in this library. And it also works across any aspect ratio. I think the team that worked on this, they had to make like 1,028 discrete animated compositions. And yet everything worked, and it all felt seamless and of one mindset. So even as we move to the logos, as we move to the crests, you see that momentum, you see the trajectory, you see the match cuts. So that's just one example of how at Buck, we're definitely seeing that motion is becoming an intrinsic part of branding and how a brand expresses itself. But maybe in the audience, you're not a graphic designer or you don't work in brand. Maybe you are an illustrator, like where I started. So I wanted to share this project that Buck recently completed with DoorDash. They had to revamp their product and brand illustration system from scratch and also come up with something that was systematized. So for this collaboration, the team made over, I think, almost 200 discrete illustrations, and they had to be friendly, they had to be iconic, they had to be able to be read quickly, right? You're just glancing at your phone in a second. But it was this incredible opportunity also to be like, hey, you get to make the one ramen bowl that's gonna be the ramen bowl, which I love. And you know, in product might not be the first place you think of when you're working in illustration, but to me, I think it's a pretty remarkable canvas because this image is going to be seen by 37 million people a month, and it's going to be seen in a really intimate setting, right? It's really a part of your life. And once again, just a dash of motion adds a lot. All you need is that little bounce to kind of add a moment of delight to let you know that like dinner's coming, let's go, super excited. And it's nothing that wasn't there conceptually at the drawing phase. It's just taking the images and moving them over time. But maybe, in the audience, your first love language isn't Illustrator. And that's okay, because my first love language was Photoshop. So I wanted to share another example that was more in a collage style. This is for all the raster-based artists in the audience. Buck collaborated with Spotify's in-house creative team to create this series of out-of-home posters and social posters in what was called the Spotify Now campaign. And it was really inspired by how unique all of us are and how unique all of our playlists are. So we tapped a wide range of artists, and we wanted to come up with things that really captured that feeling of like, what could a like, this is my now hot and sweaty playlist feel like? And that would feel really different than another playlist. And once again, motion adds a lot. So when I'm putting on my now tucked in playlist, I'm like, I am feeling like that little squishy face person. I I love the way that that frog has that zine energy for Spotify now, not right now. And looking at, these 2 feet that are just there, that illustration is fantastic. But as those feet are swinging back and forth, I really notice how those toes are intertwined. And it makes me wonder what's happening off the canvas while they're listening to the Now Smooch playlist. So I hope these examples have inspired you to see all the different ways that motion design can be applied. And if it did, I'm really excited for you because up next we're going to have Paola Chen joining the stage to demo in After Effects so you can actually see some artwork come to life. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Paola, and I'm a senior animator at Buck. I love making things. I love creating. I like exploring new tools and trying out new techniques. But my favorite thing is to combine these together and see what new things can be made. Because when you combine new techniques with new softwares, you have no idea what's going on. So then you just end up making some cool experiments sometimes. What you saw just now was a bit of my work that I've done so far. And before we go into the demo, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself. So I was born in this tiny little country called Costa Rica, but I was raised in a Chinese household. So as a good Asian immigrant parent, of course, they wanted their child, me, to grow up to be a lawyer or a doctor, but I had different plans. I wanted to be an artist. And that is because back in school, I remember I was never really good with academic stuff. Sorry, mom and dad. But I knew that I loved art. So when the opportunity came, where they asked us to make presentation slides, I was so excited. Yes, I said presentation slides. And that is because I knew that I could finally add images. This was one of the rare times in school that I could add visuals and art, the things that I loved. So I was really excited for that. So then I got out my computer. I started crafting my slides to a point that I actually ended up making a whole animation. And I'm not talking about like transitions between slides. I'm talking about characters interacting with each other in the single slide. And let me remind you, this was animated in a presentation slide software. So obviously it was really janky, but I made use of the most basic animation tools. And it worked. People understood my message, and best of all, they were entertained. So you guys, I was really, really excited because I felt like I had unlocked something. And let me show you how excited I was with this reenactment. This excited. And just to give you one last example of this thing that I have unlocked, this whole introduction. I was able to tell you my life story on how I got into animation through a presentation that, fun fact, was animated through a presentation slide, just like I did back in school. Well, now I've been a Buck for over 5 years, animating with real animation software, but also animating with people that share that same excitement. So, as you look into my cartoony eyes, zooming into yours, let me tell you right now that I am so pumped to be here today because I want to get you excited to explore motion design as this powerful tool for unlocking your creativity, to help you think outside your usual methods, and to express your ideas in fresh and innovative ways. Are we ready to explore motion design? Okay, let me exit out of my presentation and let's go into Illustrator. What you're seeing right here is a road trip playlist cover called Rolling Tunes. My friends and I like to travel together, and we like to create a playlist where we drop in songs that we like to jam to. So, knowing that I was gonna come to Miami, of course, they came along. So, obviously, we had to create a Rolling Tunes Miami edition, which is what you're seeing right now. We decided to call it Sunshine State of Mind. And with that context in mind, let's dive into how I brought this animation to life. Over here on the left, you will see a few iterations of the designs, and then I finally landed on the final design. To make it feel a little bit more sunshiny, I added some color with this crisp morning blue background, a punch of red, and a few effects here and there. And I was done. I was done with the design. But was I really done? As I look into our design, was this really going to represent sunshine, state of mind, as I dramatically zoom into it? I don't know. I felt like something was missing. I don't know what it was. Well, lucky for us, this is where motion design comes in to add that extra depth to our design. Well, so then I got crafting my artwork again. I rolled up my sleeves, and I separated our shapes into their different layers and renamed it accordingly because I wanted to keep this file organized, knowing that I would be importing this file into cue dramatic piano music. Bum, bum, bum. After Effects, After Effects, After Effects. Now that we're here in After Effects, you will see on the left that we have our 2D design. And after animating, running it through After Effects, we ended up with this final animation. As you can see, the animation is quite subtle, is nothing flashy, because at the end of the day, the main thing is our design. And animation in this case is just a secondary part of our design, just to support it. I have applied 3 different techniques. The first one is the 3D extrude, where we converted our music note into a 3D object by adding some depth. The second is the trim path tool, where we're using to reveal the little squiggle at the bottom. And the last one is, if I zoom in a little bit, bloop, you will see that our little flower has a subtle wiggle. And this technique is also known as a boil, which is a really common technique to add a little bit of liveliness to our still objects. All right, enough talking, let's start making. For today's demo, I will only be focusing on how to make this 3D note. Believe it or not, this takes less than a minute and is only a few steps. So, are we ready to go on an After Effects road trip? Great. I like the energy. The first thing that we're going to be doing is to import that Illustrator file that I was showing you earlier. And I'm going to import it into our projects panel on the left. I'm going to import it as a composition so that we keep all of the layers separated. Also, I know I said it takes less than a minute, but because I'm going to be walking you through all the steps, it will take more than a minute. Okay, great. So now that we have imported our file, you will see that it has created a composition. And inside of this composition, we have all of our layers named and arranged just how we had in Illustrator. It is really easy to incorporate Illustrator and After Effects together. I am going to select all of our layers except for the music node because that will be the only thing that we are going to be working with. And I'm going to click on this little shy person icon. So once I click it, you will see that it has, in fact, shied away. And then we're going to click on the shy toggle over here to actually hide it from the timeline. You will see that the layers are gone, but they are still in our composition. And I like to do this just so that we keep the timeline clean and not scary. The next step that we're going to do is to convert our layer, which is currently an Illustrator layer, into a native After Effects shape layer. And how we do that is by selecting our music layer, going up to our layer menu, and then clicking on create, and then create shapes from vector layer. So we have now created a native shape layer in After Effects, and you will see it because there's a little star icon on it. In this Illustrator layer, I'm just going to shy it away. Okay, now we're ready to dig into the 3D world inside of After Effects. And sometimes it might be scary, but it's really, really easy. And how we do that is by having the layer selected and going back to our layer menu, which, by the way, we're going to be spending a lot of time in. So I'm going to find the 3D layer option, and then we click it, and now we have converted our flat 2D layer to be a 3-dimensional layer, and we know that because we have this little gizmo up here. So if I were to rotate it, you will see that now we can rotate it in space. It is looking a little flat, and we want to add some depth to it. So what we're going to do is to extrude this shape. But before I do that, I want to change the fill of this shape to just a stroke, just so that you can see a little bit of how the extrusion happens better. So how we're going to do that is by clicking on this layer. We're going to twirl the contents open. And inside of it, we will find the group, which is the shape. And then you will see that inside of it, we have like the path information, where we can change the path, or the fill, which in this case, I am going to hide for now. And instead, I am going to add a stroke. So how I do that is by going into the Add button over here, and you will see a few properties, and I'm looking for the stroke. So now we have added a stroke, and it is there, I promise. You cannot see it because it's white, so let me just change it to be a red. So now we have converted our shape to be an outline. So now we're ready to extrude our shape. I am going to collapse the contents. How we're going to extrude it is by going into the geometry options, which you will see over here, and at the moment is grayed out. But the After Effects gods are telling us to change the render, so then we will do so. So I'm going to click Change Render, and it is currently set to a classic 3D, which is the default for After Effects. But for today, we're going to be changing it to an advanced 3D, because that will allow us to do the extrusion and other things. So I'm going to click OK, and now our geometry options are now available for us. So I'm going to open it up, and we will find the extrusion depth. And if I start extruding, you will see that something is happening. Okay, this is pretty cool. So if I were to rotate it, you will see that actually we have extruded way too much. So I am going to reduce it back to a 500 extrusion. I know that a lot of people see After Effects as this animation tool and for effects, for comping, which is, yeah, it can do that. But I like to see After Effects also as a tool to keep on designing. For instance, we brought our design where we started it in Illustrator, and then we brought it into After Effects just to continue designing. And what I mean by that is that now that we have a 3-dimensional shape, I would like to make use of that 3D-ness and just continue designing and see what new compositions we can make with it. So then I am going to change the rotation of our object just so that we can see a little bit of its depth. So I'm going to click on, in the transform properties, click on the Y rotation, and just to show a little bit of its side, I'm going to rotate it. And since this is a 3-dimensional object, we get to rotate it however we want. So then I'm also going to rotate it in its C space, just to add a bit of more dynamicism to our design. I am also noticing that based on this bounding box, our object is looking a little distorted. So I'm going to add a camera just to keep it flat looking. So if we go back to our good old menu, layer menu, we're going to go to New, and then click on Camera. And then I'm going to keep the preset to be 200, just so that it looks flat. So now we have flattened our design a little bit, and it looks more stylized. So then the next step is to just continue arranging our music note in our composition. And afterwards, we're going to be rotating this. But I am noticing that our anchor point is actually in the front of the music note. And when we start rotating it, it would be nice if it were to be rotating it from its center point. So if I switch the view to a 90 degrees so we see the side, we want to move this anchor point to be right here in the middle. And how we do that is by going into the anchor point properties and just changing the property to be in the center. How we know the center is that if you remember earlier, our extrusion depth was 500. So from the face of our object to the back, that's 500. And if we want to go to the middle, it will be in the center. Yes, I am making you do math. But remember, I'm not good with academic stuff, so if I can do it, you can do it. So then, let's go into the anchor point. So knowing that our extrusion is 500, we want to bring it to 250. In our anchor point, you will see that we have 3 values. We have the x, the y, and the z. And how do we know which value we're going to be using? We can just easily hover over the gizmo, and it will tell us that this arrow is the z value. So I'm going to the z value, which is currently 0, and I'm going to type in 250. So now we have brought our anchor point to the middle. So then once we start animating, it will animate from the center. So let me bring it back to how I had it before. And then I'm just going to finalize our final composition. OK, we are done with our redesign, I guess. The next step is to add a more interesting color to our object. At the moment, we only have this fill. And what I want to do is actually to add a more dynamic gradient to our object. And how we're going to do that is by creating an environment layer. And we're going to use this gradient to shine on our object. I know it sounds a little confusing, so let me just show you what I am talking about. The first thing is to add a light to our 3D scene. So I'm going to click on Layer, and I'm going to create a new light. And let's make sure that our light type is set to environment. So now we have added an environment light to our scene. But nothing has happened because we have not added any environment. And the environment that we're going to be using today is a gradient, which is just a regular gradient that I did in Photoshop. So if I open our Finder, I have prepared this gradient. That is just a simple 3-color gradient that I exported out of Photoshop as a HDR, which is a high dynamic range image, meaning that your environment can be anything. It could be a photograph or an illustration, as long as it's an HDR. So I'm going back to our main composition, and I'm going to add our HDR, our environment gradient, into our composition. And now it's acting like a regular gradient, covering all of our hard work. Well, it's easy. Let's go back to our environment light and change our source from default to our environment gradient. It has now disappeared, but now is being used as a light. And I know that it's a little hard to see it right now because our shape is this block of red. So if we go back to our shape and we change the base color to a white, then we will see it better. I can do that by either going to its contents, or I can just go up here where it says stroke, and I will change that to a white. OK, so now we're starting to see that gradient a little bit better. Let's make it a little bit clearer by changing the material of our music note. So we want to make it a little more reflective, a little bit shinier. So if we go back to our music note, you will see that down at the bottom, there is a material options that I'm going to open up, and then you will find a specular shininess that is 5%. So I'm just going to make it 100%, and you will now see that our gradient is showing a little bit better. And what we're seeing right now is a little bit of this blue, but I kind of want to bring it to this red. So how we do that is by going to our environment light and just rotate it until we like how it looks like. So I'm going into its transform properties. I am going to change the X rotation. And now we're starting to see a little bit of that red. And I'm just going to play around with how this looks like. OK, this looks great. And now we are done with coloring, or with this light. The last step that I want to show you for this demo is a little bit of animation. And it's going to be a really simple rotation where the music note is going to rotate from point A to point B. So how we do that is, if we go into its transform properties, and then we go into its Y rotation, we can set our first keyframe by clicking on the stopwatch. So once we click on this stopwatch, it has now converted to blue, and now we have created our first diamond-shaped keyframe. So this will be our first position. If I go into the middle of our composition, so our composition right now is set to 4 seconds. So I'm just going to go to the middle where that is 2 seconds. And then I am just going to rotate it to see where I want to put it. So maybe something like this. And then I'm going to go to the end of our composition, and I'm going to add the last keyframe. And that is, like I said, we're going from point A to point B, back to point A. So I can either put the value, or I can just simply copy and then paste our keyframe. And if I preview it, you will see that our music note has come alive. But it's currently looking a little bit robotic, and that is because it's missing a little bit of that ease. So I'm just going to select all of our keyframes, and I'm going to right-click on one of it and click on Assistant and just easy ease this. So once we preview this, you will see that the motion now feels way softer because we added ease. We added that acceleration and deceleration, which feels more real life. And we are basically done with this demo. Obviously, you can add more effects to it. I added a layer of grain. I changed the levels a little bit by upping the saturation, and just to make it a little bit punchier. So you can do whatever you want, but this is the base of this demo. Well, here's the thing. There is no one right way to do things, and that is the beauty of making things. Everyone has their own way of creating, and that is what I love about experimenting. It's all about trying things out. And the good news is that if you're sitting here, or if you're watching online, that means that you have already taken that first step. You are now open and willing to take your craft to the next level. And I know you might not remember all the steps on how to make this music note. You're forgiven. But what I want you to take away from this demo is to be open to experimenting and to enjoy it while you're doing it. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you coming here.